Have you ever ridden a bus? I have. It's not always fun. Imagine if a bus picks you up from your neighborhood. That bus is jamming out tunes and you're down for the distance. This bus trip is really fun. They're playing that song you and your buddies tried to learn in high school. They're jamming out to that hit from the movie you remember. One-hit wonders you forgot about too. Oh, there's that song from your first wedding you don't hate. Either way, whoever's picking the tunes for this road trip really relates to me. So the bus stops and picks up more people along the route through your part of town. All those people really enjoy the music selection too. It's not 100% for 100%, but most everybody enjoys it enough, singing along, enjoying the ride, and the energy of communal enjoyment. A bit further from where you live, more passengers step on and politely sit for the trip. After a while, more and more passengers on that trip, on that side of town, eventually get on the bus. Eventually, as the seats begin to fill up, someone from the back comes up and asks if they could sit next to you. You don't ask why. You just accommodate. And before you know it, most of the people who got on when you got on and shortly thereafter had moved up front while the new riders from the other part of town were sitting toward the rear. This bus is still cranking out a lot of music you really like, but then one passenger from the back stands up and asks if we might be able to change the station. It would seem, after all this time of everyone enjoying this music we love, now some people don't want to listen to it anymore. Worse yet, they want to listen to music I don't like. That just won't do. So those from the front tell those from the back, no, we've got the music for the trip set. The music that's been playing is the music that will always play. That's just how it's going to be. We were here first and picked you up. We make the rules. The trip commences and those in the back feel slighted, forced to sit and listen to music they don't like, when it's just as easy to change the music, even for a little while, then change it back. Or mix the music so we never need to change. It just accommodates everyone, most of the time, and nobody feels left out. Then the rear sitters ask again. They're denied with more hostility because how dare they ask when they've already been told no? Then the rear sitters decide to make their own music and sing louder in harmony, drowning out the music from the fronters altogether. Now the fronters feel violated, stepped on, and abused. The fronters have been wronged. So the fronters all demand they stop singing so the fronters can hear their music. The rear sitters realize the fronters didn't get the message, and the voices raise. If you'd just let us listen to some of our music, then we wouldn't have to make our own. This ain't your bus. Get off if you don't like the music we play. The clash between the fronters, who labeled themselves fronters so they feel like they were at the front first, and the rear sitters, which was denigrating in and of itself because we're saying rear, and that sounds like butts, even though it's the back of the bus. When moderates discuss being the reasonable and rational political pool in America because they seek compromise, understand that the only compromise they seek is that of morals and ethics, character and integrity. Why are we so quick to dismiss others? We don't want to hear them or acknowledge their truth. Especially now, society is at a boiling point that, well, boils down to empathy, compassion, critical thinking. Have you ever ridden a bus? I have. It's not always fun. Imagine a bus picks you up from your neighborhood. Now, that bus is jamming out tunes, and it's a lot of music that brings up some bad memories for you. There's a few good songs, but mostly it's not the kind of music you'd pick for an entire road trip. And they were playing that song that was playing when your buddies got chased by a car in high school. They're jamming out to that hit from that movie that showed someone who looked like you in a really stereotypical way, and you never understood how a song could be a hit on the radio coming from that movie. One-hit wonders you forgot about too, sure. Some toe tappers. But then, there's that song from your first wedding that brings up all your hurt. Everybody wants to be a fronter. Most of us are rear sitters, to be honest. The biggest disappointment of all is that many of us rear sitters think we're fronters. Worse yet, some of those poor schmeals think they might actually get to drive the bus one day. So many simply can't see a perspective other than the one they assume for themselves, even if it's seeing things from the front of the bus when you're barely even allowed on the bus to begin with. This episode is about just that. And welcome to the podcast. Today we see a lot of people finally feeling like they have a voice enough to speak up when something bothers them. Or they feel like something might bother someone else who still might not feel empowered to speak up for themselves. More and more people are calling out certain depictions of certain groups in what we might deem classic movies or television, which can be hurtful. There are many reasons to address these issues, but representation and accurate representation is top on the list. For many, that might be the only representation of that group some folks get, ever. We all love The Simpsons, but we have to admit that Apu is offensively stereotypical. Whether that is corrected now is irrelevant to this discussion. Let's congratulate them on not doing it anymore while discussing openly and honestly why it was ever okay to begin with. I'm a voice actor. I've done almost every accent you can think of in one way or another, maybe not professionally. I can do so many I shouldn't ever do and won't do anymore. I could audition for any number of projects and not be problematic until they see my profile picture, but that's not right to do anymore. Wrong. It wasn't ever right to do. Society just evolved collectively to where I'm no longer going to get away with impersonating the voice of another race group or stereotype. And to be clear, I'm a voice actor. I could do many accents in earnest without being stereotypical. I just don't. Mostly because some of it's wrong, a lot of it is. But equally because I don't deserve a job over someone who natively speaks that accent and doesn't have to act. It didn't matter in previous years. If a white actor voiced a black character in a cartoon, we turned a blind eye. If a male did a female's voice, if a woman did a gay man's voice, there was a time when we didn't consider the implications or the ramifications. And today we do. That train of thought leads us to a place where we begin getting uncomfortable seeing Apu and hearing Apu, knowing that behind that colorful caricature is Hank Azaria, a New Yorker with Greek and Jewish heritage who also voiced Chief Wiggum, Moe, and Comic Book Guy, to name a few. They're all yellow, no issues there, but Apu is clearly not, and Azaria is clearly not, of Apu's heritage. Beyond the stereotypical implications, there are the ramifications of costing an accent native actor an opportunity. And we don't fault anyone specific for this. I don't guess we do anyway, since this was more of an industry norm for so long, rooted, of course, in white supremacy. But on an institutional level, not on the Hank Azaria level. He didn't do anything. Hank just did his job. I'm sure those conversations weren't even had back in the late 1980s and early 90s the way they are today. We didn't consider back then, if you're of Italian heritage, do you really want people watching The Sopranos and thinking they get you? No. Which is why a lot of people are upset about the Mario movie from the video games. But no more than the Andy Griffith Show, the Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, Gomer Pyle is representative of my typical white Southern heritage. So, representation, diversity, it matters. Even diversity within diversity matters. All white people aren't the same. There is a kaleidoscope of black culture, just like with Latin culture, every culture. Representation over stereotyping. With Apu, the stereotypical implications are harmful and hurtful on a grander scale. At very least, if one wants to argue that character is acceptable in that context, even if voiced by an authentic accent, the character of Apu is not a positive representation as the only representation someone might experience. You've heard of face blindness, where you completely space on what someone's face looks like. Ethnic color blindness is sort of like that. I've mentioned this in previous episodes. The larger lump of people, rather than needling it down to specifics. The specifics make it hard to generalize. And generalizations are easy. It's a low-hanging fruit. It's the path of least intellectual resistance. I know because I use them with my own people, deliberately, liberally. So instead of Ethiopian, you just say African. Instead of Korean, you might say Asian. Latinx is a prime example. It's a way of organizing data in our minds, data we internally feel guilty about not knowing. We know we don't know the difference between a Guatemalan and a Honduran, so decent people lean to Latinx, while those less evolved just lump them in with Mexico because everything south of America must be Mexico to them. These people think America is North America because in America, we're just America and everybody else isn't. Except to everyone else, we are the United States, or the US, or the USA, or the United States of America. America? This huge North, Central, and South hemisphere? Pole to pole, Canada, us, them, pole, toxic white Southern culture. Part of it is a fear of guessing wrong and looking like a racist, but it's geographical too. Austrian and Germans, Belgian or French, Scottish, Irish, British, or Australian. Sorry, Aussies. The Netherlands? Good luck. But it isn't all racist or even maliciously motivated. I see that you have X characteristics, and so you're most likely associated with this group. Sometimes when we care enough to, we go deeper and narrow that down even more, usually to something in common with ourselves, human nature. But we immediately categorize people, registering the data in our brains, just like everything else we take in. We see a fruit bowl sitting on a counter. It's orange, must be an orange. Green might be a pear or apple or something, but it's fruit. It's in a bowl. That's as much as we need to know at that point. It becomes ethnic face blindness, though, when it's a deliberate and consistent attitude of just stopping there. If everyone is just a continent to you, well, that creates the, forgive me, they all look alike sentiment. I grew up with that about every group but my own, really. And after the insurrection on our nation's capital, I have to say, we all kind of look, well, I'm just saying, we don't like having these talks because they're offensive and embarrassing. They all look alike. That statement is offensive, whichever they are. The sentiment is even more disturbing. It's always been offensive. Not just now that it's about my own group. Now think about that. You're not saying this entire group of people has so few characteristics or uniqueness that you can't tell one from the other. You're saying that because you don't regard them as people, you don't take the time to see the unique characteristics. They don't matter enough to you to be seen. Toxic and intolerable behavior? Yeah. However, I believe I can explain at least part of it in a way that might make sense. Not to justify the hate or bigotry, but to help us understand the less nefarious parts of why it happens. Like the fruit in a bowl I mentioned earlier, we take in the data we immediately need, and we prioritize obtaining the rest. Think of it like this. If you look at your cat every day, eventually when you look at other cats, you'll begin looking for cats that look like yours, and you'll notice those more. Same with cars. How many times have you lived your life completely unaware, oblivious of a certain make or model of a car until you see it on TV, a commercial, whatever. Then all of a sudden, you notice. You see them everywhere. Brainwashing. Imagine staring at your face every day, photos, mirrors, and then seeing a majority of similar faces to yours in your family, work, or social bubbles. You can surely see how easy it is to fall into the trap of sort of ethnic face blindness. We do it every day innocently enough. We've all had that moment where we just can't recall someone's face, what they look like. But part of this is simply how the brain works. There's a science to it that I'm not qualified to explain. But part of this, however, is how we're taught. That's where it's toxic. Even if we have a diverse set of friends, there are so many different physical and facial features, characteristics that we fall into a trap of generalizing. Part of it is because learning new information is off-putting for most of us as it is, especially if that information is tied to uncomfortable things like race, religion, gender, sexuality, etc. We get uncomfortable around those traits or characteristics that are different from ours or challenge our ways of thinking because we've been taught not to stare. which is sort of a trauma precursor to the PTSD response of not even paying attention to someone and disregarding them altogether, I discussed in the Politics of Dancing Part 2. We sort of mentally dismiss them because thinking too much about it, taking the time to register their characteristics, traits, or qualities, it makes us uncomfortable subconsciously. We're trapped in a cycle of trying to fill in those blanks while feeling guilty for trying too hard to fill them in. We see someone with an amputated limb. We used to say amputee. However, we know now labeling someone by their struggle isn't optimal language for them or society. They're a person with a disability, not a disabled person. The acknowledgement of the person comes before the other identifier. I'm a curious person. Maybe we really are interested in finding out more about what it's like to go through life with one arm, learn their story, and seek to understand their struggles. But we just sit awkwardly trying not to stare, to take in information. Be polite. And we should. That person shouldn't spend their life explaining themselves, and we shouldn't make them feel any differently. But internally, there is also a shutdown of processing that data fully. Because it makes us uncomfortable, we don't ask for that perspective, which may or may not be the right thing to do. The problem is we get so uncomfortable that we don't really even think about it ourselves. We don't consider their perspective. It's that basket of things we don't understand. We move on so the uncomfortable feelings will stop. We grab a magazine, read a recipe we'll never try, and we try not to stare. We don't even like peas. Why would I read a pea risotto recipe? I just want to not be in this moment right now. You know what I mean? The information processing has come to a halt. So no matter how badly we want to ask, we don't ask questions or even bring it up. It's sort of the unspoken struggle. It's offensive to walk up to someone and say, hey, why do you wear that getup? However, those conversations, when they happen appropriately, can be pathways to understanding. It's like asking to touch someone's hair. No one should touch someone's hair. That's wrong, but just weird. But I have to say, that very conversation about hair with an African-American friend when I was younger, and I didn't know any better, was a launching pad internally for me to see that their experience with just that is so much different than my own. How else could someone else experience life differently than I do? I know that sounds passé, maybe stereotypical, but it really did send me down a different path of empathetic reasoning. I just had to sort of treat another human being like a petting zoo to get there. But I have really soft hair, and it was weird, but mutually beneficial at the same time. Problematic, but a learning experience for us both, I think. It's awkward and uncomfortable trying to break down those barriers, but if someone is genuinely and authentically curious about your journey, regardless of our labels, we should encourage seeking that perspective in healthy ways, you know? Good for you for asking, right? That's better than not. I mean, do not ask to touch someone's hair. Anybody's. And maybe don't create an awkward situation and just Google it first, but you see what I mean? Asking is better than just dismissing and chucking in all of that into some generalized basket of things you don't understand. And look, we rarely go back to that basket, pull something out for later and think about it more. That's in the discard pile. And that discard pile isn't just ideas or experiences or memories. There are people in there. The thing is, we barely have these cultural conversations in our own groups. These conversations help us break down those walls where we compartmentalize things in unhealthy or stereotypical manners. That compartmentalization that comes with ethnic or racial colorblindness. If everyone's just a general area, you're going to miss the brilliance of their culture and individuality. We are the sum of all our parts, but not just our parts. Like we discussed before in the human mathematical equation, our parts are also our parents' parts, and friends and siblings and church, TV, movie characters, and brands. Cultism and misapplied and ill-prioritized values of pride and loyalty. When all those parts are steeped in toxicity or outdated ideals or a narrow perspective with limited diversity, we'll all suffer, socially and otherwise. Especially when we aren't feeding ourselves a balanced diet of ideas. Right now, when the generation of those outdated ideals and toxicity is still around. Not to answer for it, but to answer, period. Answer why it was okay. Song of the South, the classic Disney movie that sends a zippity-doo-dah into cancellation. I saw that as a child with no context whatsoever. I didn't see it as problematic when I watched it, and therefore other things weren't problematic that were similar. It simply wasn't problematic back then. I mean, it was to people, but that was more the accepted social norm of this culture. Why did somebody have to point that out? Because it was problematic when it was made. It was made deliberately with those undertones. A great big inside joke for the white folk in Hollywood. And we allowed that as a society, as a country, because those people didn't matter to us. Why doesn't that register? I believe these are the conversations to have, and with the intent of understanding more than condemning. Condemn those who do know better today, and those who still insist on being problematic or enabling that. Seek to understand from those who are willing to come forward and talk about it candidly and honestly. It's not as easy as saying these hateful people will die off in the next 20 years or so, because they won't. I mean, they will, but death comes for all. But the ideas will linger, and those will be passed on by these ignorant people into other ignorant people. Because just like my dad learned from his dad, I learned from my dad, and my daughters learned from their dad. Hopefully, thanks to that moment I spoke about last episode where my brother set me straight, I am setting at least somewhat of a better example than I had. That's the goal, isn't it? It's also accepting that these attitudes of toxicity aren't just on our parents or people we love. They are ideas that we get fed from entry into this world. And that's why taking a hard look at the Seuss books I spoke about in the previous episode is so important. It's permission for that idea to exist. There are children who would see those images, and it might reinforce an idea later in life. These ideas were a part of our culture for so long. If we're going to come clean and have the real talk, I think we all need to say it was a different time, and that time is over. Another perspective of why this social shift is happening right now is that with more and more immigration over the last century or more, many more people have come here. Maybe we've seen more people coming to America to escape what America has been drifting toward these last few decades. Maybe speaking up is coming from a perspective of having seen what this becomes. This isn't always oversensitivity. This is a warning. The ideas at battle here are the ideas I've covered since the first episode of the season. It's why I began with talking about political misconceptions. This is about traditionalists and progressivists. The conservative versus the progressive. Tradition versus progress. We're gaslit and herded into either or pens of deplorable Republicans or baby-killing Democrats. Those who wave the Confederate loser flag are also the first to tell you the Democrats were the party of the KKK. It's also man-made and manufactured cultism. On both sides, without seeking the truth. The truth is so readily available now in our front pockets now, more than ever before in human history. We carry entire libraries of the world, little Alexandrias in our purse. Progress isn't always right. My dad used to own an amphibious car. This was a car manufactured that could drive into the water and become a boat. And it's the 21st goddamn century. Buck Rogers, where's my James Bond car? Right? Sometimes innovation just gets it wrong and we move on. Or it isn't profitable. Or it's too advanced or accessible and screws up rich people having all the nice things. But progressivism is responsible for every single advancement in American history and arguably the world. It's also very dangerous. Progressivism, run amok, can easily bankrupt a country. Big ideas and now. That's why conservatism is so important for that balance. When we say free healthcare, we need someone to say, take it easy there, Turbo. How are we paying for it? And what happens to the gaping hole in our economy from the healthcare industry? Then we seek answers together for the greater good. That isn't all about making money. Except that conversation hasn't been had in many years in Washington. Instead, it's about political ploys and strategy, re-election bids and redistricting. It's about power brokering, keeping your donors donating, and making sure you don't have primary challengers within your own party. Today, the very system of balance our balanced system is balanced on is unbalanced. The scales are heavily weighted against we the people. They can't outnumber us, so they'll hoard the wealth of the world. We don't think about how little we make, about just how insultingly small our piece of the pie is. We're too busy insulting each other, aren't we? Labeling and categorizing, good or bad. We're grateful because we're told we're barely worth what we earn. When we start to question this system that keeps us broke and paycheck to paycheck, depending on the kindness, grace, or greed of another to keep us employed. That's why the wealthy have the police, right? We don't fight back. We take what we're given. And even when the world falls down around us and we heard our leaders talking about opening up the economy again amidst a deadly, raging pandemic rather than making it safe for people not to die, and we start to see how we've sold our souls. We were faced with what was presented at the time as the greatest crisis of our generation, and specifically in this country. Americans threw hissy fits over having to wear a mask just to not get everyone else sick. People would have rather questioned the facts and science than their own ethical and moral compromise. That wasn't enough. It was the name-calling and abhorrent, deplorable dehumanization experienced culturally. This culture of cultism in America, herding into either-or pens of opinion, climbing those hills ready to die on them for the sake of our foolish pride. During COVID, many proved they were willing to kill, or at least for many others to die, for the sake of that foolish pride. Who are we? We need to have these conversations now while these generations are still around so we can actually learn from these people. Good people, maybe, misled people, just with toxic, indoctrinated ideals. Before it's too late. Before this generation is gone and we're too afraid to ask these questions for fear of dishonoring the dead. And then here we are again, back in the same social cycle we've been in for nearly a century and a half, at least. Ask the hard questions to yourself. Why do you think it's okay to keep children, humans, any living creature in cages? I bet you're not willing to go that far. And then when you figure out that you feel that way because of someone else's influence, go back and challenge them on why they feel it's okay. Kids in cages. Just an example. Any issue, though. What, you don't remember kids in cages? It was all the social media rage for about 3 months there for a while. After all, kids in cages didn't happen before 2020 and certainly still doesn't happen. Right? That story kind of just went away. But didn't we tear each other apart over it, saying deplorable things about other human beings for like 3 months? Until we moved on to the next thing to dehumanize each other over. Well, the quiet part out loud in America is that some Americans don't care who is kept in a cage or for whatever reason. Some of those Americans care even less if the person is anything but white, straight, Christian, and male. That is just a disgusting fact that has been bred culturally in ways I'll get into shortly. Are we ready to talk about that feeling? That feeling when a news alert comes across your phone? There's been an awful accident. It's an Amber Alert. That feeling of dread that comes with that kind of news, empathetic dread, open it, skim for information, data, and then swipe it away. A name or a picture. You shake that initial thought and feeling off, stubbornly convinced it's because we don't know anyone like that. Maybe share it to social media, partly for public service, but partly so everyone else won't see what you saw for a brief glimpse in your own mind. And we don't stop to think. Because we don't want to think about A, why did I feel this way? B, I dismiss this because I don't know anyone named Alvarez. We're afraid of these revelations because we're scared of how to rectify them. We're scared of what they mean for our core foundational values we've come to embrace. even the subconscious ones we secretly hate but still can't shake. We're scared of our own helplessness in these situations, even more scared knowing we could do something, but we don't, even internally. Now, we swipe that story away and we move on. We get the notification on our phone to go bye-bye, and we stop thinking about how we almost cared for a minute and then didn't anymore when the person was brown or had an ethnic-sounding name. We stop thinking about that rush of concern and how that rush of concern immediately deflated when we realized it was about someone we didn't care about. Toxic white Southern culture. You're really going to tell me you don't know what I'm talking about? I promise you, someone you know does. And we're too sick at the thought and the guilt that we don't pause to ask, good God, why? Those answers, if you insist, can be an indictment on character or a revelation to a much greater cancer at play. You know yourself. You know for a fact that it doesn't matter who's standing in front of you. If they're a human in need, you will show compassion, right? You know this. Yet when faced with a seemingly abstract moral dilemma, your mind goes where it instinctively goes based on early indoctrination and learning. Your psyche takes the path of least intellectual resistance, until we tell it not to. Part of that is categorization for survival mode, animal instinct. Some is toxic dehumanization brainwashing. The thing is, through every single media outlet, every influence, negative stereotypes, stigmas, and stories prevail. You know you don't wish harm on anyone, but because of this cancerous ideology of dismissiveness and generalizations, we're stuck looking at our phones in momentary dismay because we almost cared about a missing kid until we found out A, the kid wasn't one of ours, or B, we don't know anyone like that, so what help can we be beyond sharing the story? A, something's broken. Get that right and fix it. That's the sociopathic disconnect of compassion and empathy I'm talking about. That comes from those feelings, shaking those feelings off without accounting for why they're there to begin with. You do that enough, then you'll numb down your soul to the point that you truly don't care if a kid from another group goes missing. You might even think good, one less. When we use the word deplorable, that is what it's intended for. That is how this sort of vile attitude prevails. One day they just don't matter to you at that moment. The next they don't matter to you at that moment on a specific issue. The next they don't matter at all. If one person's life doesn't matter to someone, at some point yours won't either. But with B, we don't know anyone like that, so what help can we be beyond sharing the story? Have we just admitted that if we weren't so closed off to other ideas, cultures, or people, then we would be in more of a position to help save that child? That our own admission that we don't know anyone like that is a call to action to understand why we don't know someone like that, or why we insist on thinking someone is like that. And what does like that actually mean to us? Remember, the only thing you need in order to have an opinion is to get it from somewhere. Rarely do we examine where we get our opinions and ideas. I had this bizarre bigotry for a long time toward Malaysians. I used it mostly for comic fodder because I'd never met anyone from Malaysia in real life, so what does it hurt, right? One time on this message board in the early days of the internet, me and my nerd friends were run off by Malaysians who came into the chat room and they took the whole thing over. The online room, not the actual room. So we all left. I've talked more in depth about this before. Trying to be pragmatic, being in a chat with two different languages going on simultaneously is straining to say the least. But for a kid raised to think it's okay to think and say bad things, I somehow got this chip on my shoulder against the entire country of Malaysia? I know how ridiculous that sounds, don't get me wrong. More ridiculous than that, it was because I was in this chat room first, as far as I knew, and that when others came in speaking a different language, it made it harder for me to keep up with the chat. Not Seeing them being in this space to which I felt entitled was just as, if not more, stressful for them because there were two languages that were confusing the chat feed, and I was only concerned with one of them. It's dumb, it's inconsiderate, it's selfish and narrow-minded. Because I felt like these Malaysian students, probably 6 of them, invaded my little panacea where I got to hang out with my friends and escape reality for a bit, pre-Facebook, mind you. I just don't know what kind of sense it makes, but I was so desensitized to a people I'd never met in person or whose culture I had no knowledge of. I said, well, it wasn't entirely hurtful or hateful. For me, it was the funny that lessened the impact of my trauma. With no excuse for problematics, I learned it was okay to do so through society, environment, and entertainment. So I didn't look at them as people, just props, a punchline. I didn't even see a Malaysian when I spoke about Malaysians, or a country, or anything. It was just literally a word I said to vent my disappointment over the part of my comfort zone changing before I was ready for it to. Definitions and explanations be damned, that's racism. It's bigotry. It's insanity. I can't even explain that. The me today cannot comprehend that. And that was me 25 plus years ago. It's just stupid. I'm not sure I'd ever met someone from Malaysia, though. It never came up. I'm probably too embarrassed to ask. I have no problem with Malaysians at all, or any race or group of people. Well, except some of my own, clearly. But my point is, a quarter of a century ago, this kid, who used to be a version of me that no longer exists, spoke ill and racist, I'm sure, about an entire nation of people and a culture that is as cool as it is rich. For what? To make someone chuckle? Ooh, what kind of person, ... Condemning my soul in the process. I thought it cost more. It's racism. It's bigotry. It sounds so nonsensical when you explain it that way. But it begins with the numbing down of our compassion and empathy toward others. Then, having a negative idea or stereotype reinforced or validated. We have, as a society, been dumbing down our minds and numbing down our souls. Growing up with toxicity is like growing up with a smoker. Even if you don't grow up and start smoking, you're going to reek of it one way or the other. You're probably going to suffer the consequences of breathing all that in for so long. At very least, it's difficult to argue that your lungs are completely unaffected. You may not be a smoker, but everyone around you will still smell the stench. This is what happens to the brain when you're indoctrinated by toxic, outdated, problematic ideals. It permeates like secondhand smoke on Nana's couch. We only know what we know until we know better. Look, I used to sprinkle pour sugar over my cornflakes before I learned what Frosted Flakes were. And I used to eat Frosted Flakes before I learned that sugar is poison and literally creates cancer. You don't know what you don't know until you know it. Nor did I know that corn also was sugar. Haha, type 2 diabetic. Instead of bemoaning why we have to overthink things like Snowflake and the 7 Little Miners, and why we have this new sensitive world you have to be a part of, ask yourself 2 more questions. Why is the thing hurtful to others? Why doesn't that matter to you? Because offensive, toxic, outdated references actually do hurt people. I've seen it firsthand with things I've said, and it hurt when I realized it. It embarrassed me that I was using this thing of theirs for humor. I didn't like the way it made me feel knowing I contributed to this thing that hurt someone else's feelings. It was worse knowing how many people saw or heard me trying to be funny at someone else's expense. That's just a bell you can't unring. But maybe we can learn and unlearn. Maybe we can unlearn the behavior and learn from it all. Maybe I'm just a snowflake. There's a rush to dismiss the thing that makes us uncomfortable, and I'm suggesting we be more prudent collectively in that process. That rush to just get rid of the thing without the greater conversation of consequence is where cancel culture becomes a cancer culture. I have a whole episode about political correctness or personal correction. PC is how you look at it. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't cancel the things you grew up with. Just that before we dive headfirst into canceling things, we should go in with a little more understanding of how easily impressionable the human brain really is. The more we understand that, the less we can blame ourselves for falling prey to toxic mindsets, and the easier it is to forgive ourselves, admit the missteps, grow, and move on. We see how easy it is to fall into what we're seeing now with this cult-like lemming march off the QAnon cliff. The human brain, easily tricked. Don't believe me? Think of your favorite brand of anything. Think of how you perceive that same product of a different brand. Peter Pan versus Jif, Dawn versus Palmolive. I'm not sure what the ice cream is where you're from, but where I'm from, if you ain't eating Mayfield, you ain't even eating ice cream. Coke and Pepsi, McDonald's or Wendy's, I'm willing to bet there's some pretty strong bias there if you think hard enough. That bias goes beyond just preference and prejudice. We are brainwashed to believe that the name brand applesauce is superior to the store brand, even though they came from the same factory, just different packaging. Just like we're brainwashed into thinking, well, everything we think or don't think about. Understanding that our thinking is influenced by something can help us to keep from repeating the same hurtful mistakes that generations before us didn't know better than to make. We can recognize toxic behavior without condemning the people we've loved as monsters for having had those attitudes. Because even the most toxic and abhorrent behaviors stem from some level of trauma. And if we're willing to look at Sneezy and accept that maybe he has an allergy, if we look at Dopey and realize how hard it must be to wake up every day and just be Dopey, if we can step out of our own pride for a moment and accept that maybe, as much as your 400-pound friend seems to like to be called Tiny or Hoss, maybe every interaction being reminded of your weight keeps them depressed where they don't believe they'll ever be anything but. And then if they did lose weight, and what would his friends call him then? Who am I if I'm not Big Bubba? It's your identity at that point. We don't think about how deeply our words, even our teasing, can affect people. So imagine if we can get to the place where we accept that even seemingly harmless teasing can be hurtful. Maybe we can start to see how these people we love and care about that seem to have fallen prey to cultism might have gotten there. A lot of this boils down to the bully and the bullied. Many folks who were bullied as kids grow up to be more understanding or compassionate, except that sometimes the victim becomes the abuser. A man spent most of his young life getting picked on and terrorized by people who weren't smart enough to debate him. He had a mouth and a death wish. He was a dick, but he was still bullied and tormented his entire life. He stood up for himself because no one else would, and rarely did it go the way it did on TV. He took a lot of hits. He dished some out too. He learned early in life that there are a lot of those who fight fairly and those who fight to win. With life already unfairly cruel to him, he discovered that with the regular assaults on his physical self and character, he better be prepared to go farther than they would. So while they had no problem pummeling his face into ground round, he leaned in to grab their balls, twist, gouging eyes, biting of ears, fingers to the throats, unsue. Learn your opponent's weakness. At one point, this young man was getting bullied by a slightly older kid who was shorter but stockier than he was. Relentless comments and trying to pick a fight he wasn't altogether sure he would win. But he managed to get himself into enough trouble to land himself in the principal's office without getting a call home. Well, he spent enough time in the office to know the lay of the land. By that point, he knew what he could get away with. In an unsupervised moment, and with some assistance from a kind soul, he managed to get a hold of this bully's file. In that, he discovered his bully had a pretty significant yet unnoticeable health defect that left him quite vulnerable. It is entirely possible, had the young man stood up to the bully, the young man could have accidentally killed the bully, not knowing he had this condition. He started to put together that this bullying relationship wasn't about him personally, rather that he presented as submissive and weaker, unlikely to challenge the bully. The young man was a pacifist. He didn't like violence because he was born and bred in violence. He knew what he was capable of, and he didn't like going there, win or lose. The next time his bully began his verbal assault, as students started to gather and see the drama unfold, the young man simply asked for a moment, walked up to his assailant, whispered calmly into his ear that if he uttered one more crossword into the young man's direction, he would... Well, he detailed specifically how he would exploit the bully's physical vulnerability, and then he would claim he didn't know about it when the police asked. The look was divinely classic. Sound crazy? I'm sure it's something I saw on television. Their relationship changed that day. They weren't best friends or even friends, but friendly, and the bullying stopped. Lesson learned. It's one I've been trying to unlearn since, because I know fighting fair doesn't work firsthand. But I know the cost of fighting dirty. I have to be wary of my words. Hillbilly, redneck, hick. These are racial slurs of my people. They're steeped in oppression, as with any other slur. I've used them liberally. Maybe I shouldn't have. I don't any longer. I coined my own phrase, don't be a yuck yuck, which I'm proud made the rounds on social media, shirt stickers in the merch store. Why do I insist on going there, even knowing generalizations can be hurtful? Maybe because these people never shied away from letting me know how they feel about me. Maybe it's because, to these people, these words affect them and describe them. And I've used these words as the ammo of slurs they use against other people. I've used the words the way I did to lump this ideology into a big deplorable bucket because it's easier and more palpable for me to digest its existence, much less the nauseating guilt of having contributed to it, much less the stinking feeling of having come from it. You see, bigotry is, after all, simply self-loathing. I've used these words maybe because my whole life I've heard people defend using the N-word because they can say it all they want, so why can't we? So by that defense, until they get it, I'm free to use my own people's slurs as I want without consequence. Well, to anyone but me, of course. Forgive me, but these slurs, these words that some wear like badges of honor, are to me among the most undesirable characteristics. Country or Southern isn't all that toxic, but things like redneck, hillbilly, and hick, these are words that come to celebrate some very toxic and nasty qualities of willful ignorance and celebrated bigotry and racism. These words, even country and Southern, are so closely associated with the Confederacy, the Confederate flag, and those ideals that even considering those words as offensive or racially insensitive seems laughable to me. Because those words don't affect me, not without assumption. I am the antithesis of a redneck, hick, hillbilly, Southern, or country. I've worked my whole life to distance myself from that aspect of my heritage because of the toxic implications. I was blessed to have a career immersed in that culture for the better part of 2 decades, with about as much reinforced stereotypes as the ones dispelled. Country radio. The accent's still there sometimes, and I do enjoy the aspects of my heritage, but I also been very offended when people assume folks from where I'm from walk around like Jethro Clampett. Why the generalized chip on my shoulder for the General Lee crowd? Those ideals of Southern values and country qualities are soiled with the ideals that culture never truly turned away from. Then that Confederate traitor flag having such prominent, normalized featuring in one of the biggest television programs of the early 1980s, telling countless young children who idolized the charming, arrogant Bo and the more level-headed leader Luke that it's perfectly okay to brandish white supremacist, un-American traitor imagery on the top of your car and run from the police like outlaws and be the heroes of the show. Turns out, America had anti-heroes long before the 1990s. It's the skewing of the lines between right and wrong, good and evil, compromising morals or ethics of those we place on a pedestal, real or imaginary. Understanding that for so many of us, the characters we come to embrace into our lives, even as entertainment, hold a special place for us. Understanding that it can be just as difficult to separate our emotions from fictional characters just as much as it can be people who were very, very much real to us. Maybe that's why when talks circulate of recasting James Bond, so many people balk at the idea of Bond being black or a woman. Like when Doctor Who regenerated into a female body. It wasn't a story I was interested in exploring, more for the sake that I'd been disinterested in the show for a bit anyway, and by the time they actually made that step, I was kind of cutting ties with many of my attachments of cultism. But I wasn't going to tell them they couldn't. I said I felt it was forced and disingenuous, capitalizing on a social movement more than a character-driven decision. However, even then, in my criticism, they weren't going to stand in the way of anyone else enjoying the thing. It was an opinion. It was an opinion that ultimately didn't even matter that much to me. If I want Doctor Who, I can always catch up on it. And if I'm that bothered by a female doctor, which I'm not, I don't have to watch those episodes. I'm not bothered by it, by the way. I just don't watch television that way anymore. But it illustrates a rationale we simply don't see anymore. Even those who would oppose a female James Bond don't recognize that they can still watch their favorite Bond movies, but for a while, until they recast the role as they have several times over the years, the movies will have a female lead. And so long as you're not a dick about it, you can blather on about how they could have been original and created a whole new character within that universe that wouldn't have that stank of white, straight male on it. A whole new character like Miles Morales. They didn't just go and make Peter Parker something he wasn't originally written as. They created a whole new version of Spider-Man. And what if they did make Peter Parker something besides a white guy? Who cares? Isn't it more problematic to argue against it than it is just to let it go? What ideal are you defending arguing against it? We aren't a let it go society, unless we have young daughters who can't stop watching that damn movie. Hopefully we could understand a little better why things that shouldn't matter so much. And so many people are affected by that. How so many cannonball off the cliff of cultism, forsaking their very humanity, selling their souls to defend a toxic depiction of a group of people on a package of food. How does that happen? Routine. Scheduled, addictive indoctrination. And we'll return to our regularly scheduled programming after this message from our sponsors, who pay a lot of money for us to say the things we've spent lots of money researching you'll respond most to. We've all heard the phrase, letting the TV raise the kids, or some version of the idea that parents take a hands-off approach to raising kids while sticking them in front of a screen to placate them. This is a problem, but we say the cliche more than we address the issue. Isn't that our society in a nutshell? For generations now, mine specifically, and certainly since, we've been sat in front of a television, computer, or phone screen since birth. Our earliest memories, for many, might center around some form of entertainment, commercialism, materialism. When I was a kid, not that I remember any of them, but I used to love McDonald's birthday parties. Maybe because I was poor as shit. Maybe because the places I grew up had nothing except outside and McDonald's. Who knows? It was the thing to do for a kid in the 80s, though. I don't even really like McDonald's all that much now. However, if you were to tell me McDonald's was closing its doors, I might come to think differently about my ambivalence. I might even compromise my pragmatism to argue that McDonald's shouldn't go away, despite their clearly unhealthy and plastic food. Why would I do that? I have a lot of positive memories associated with McDonald's through the years. As nearly every fast food chain has evolved beyond their quality and flavor palette, McDonald's still holds a special place for me, like KFC. I don't enjoy KFC as far as fried chicken goes. I have a list that goes before KFC. However, it's important to me that I see their signs sometimes. Because when I do, I remember my dad and I after the divorce, when it was just me and him. He didn't feel like cooking after work, and we stopped and got a 2-piece all-white meal, mashed potatoes and gravy. And we'd sit at the little bar in our kitchen, the home that was now down from 5, just the 2 of us. We'd sit and watch Sanford and Son on Nick at Night. Sanford and Son. Another problematic representation when that's all you're getting. Not only was Sanford and Son's depiction of African Americans not all that flattering, Red Fox was really vulgar. Now, granted, as a child, I wasn't exposed to his raw stand-up comedy, but my dad sure was. Dad was a big fan. Red Fox was crass and gross, but on Sanford and Son, he was just sort of unethical and mean. He'd make really hurtful comments about the other characters, and those characters would toss back some zingers. We were 2 guys who would wrestle, punch each other in the arm, and then we'd say really, really mean things to one another, almost mimicking those witty one-liners from our favorite sitcom characters, Fred and Lamont. I started watching more different sitcoms on my own, so he wouldn't know I was copying the jokes I'd use on him. He would call me dummy and cut me down, and I would match that energy and then some. My grandmother used to stress out about how my father and I carried on with one another. We'd just go on and on and on. I'd dismiss her anxieties and say, look, when I say you big dumb ape, what I'm really saying is, I love you, Dad. In fact, there's some twisted, sick logic to that level of abuse we doled out to one another. He led the way, but I certainly gave back. In fact, it did become some sort of transfer of affection and closeness. It's just more, you're the only person who will let me be this terrible to you. I was. He wasn't. Many people throughout my life allowed me to be shitty to them. Why? That's their trauma. Mine was the TV shows and the laughs. The attention I got for being mean tickled things within me that felt good or were somehow miswired in my psyche to make me think it was feeling good. Low-hanging fruit. I'd never been taught the true and expansive consequences for my words. My father certainly didn't enforce many. My friends enabled them and celebrated the meaner they got. Audiences laughed or groaned, which I took as approval and encouragement to push further. Something I'll talk about more in the next episode. What I didn't get was adequate sampling of the nice things. Mr. Rogers just wasn't interesting once you grew up. Eventually, we move away from Sesame Street and life becomes a nightmare on Elm Street. Here's some science many knew in the 1960s that was dismissed in the late 1970s and early 80s for the sake of commercialism. Children are impressionable, and especially at the key stages of development, teaching the children basic lessons of right and wrong, empathy and compassion, and encouraging the curious mind were essential in forming a well-rounded personality. That didn't sell products. That didn't build brand loyalty. That didn't condition workers to just be happy working. What happened was, as we grew up more and more, programming was offered more and more often. 24/7, then streaming anytime from anywhere. However, most of that programming isn't wholesome or productive. It was for entertainment purposes only. And that's just a lot of the sugary processed foods that make us bloated and complacent. The good, healthy programming that sustains us is harder to find. It isn't as flashy. Usually in a book, or usually just a guy in front of a camera. Coming up, from the TV shows we know and love to the films that make us choke on our popcorn LOLing, I'm taking a closer look at the normalized nonsense we've allowed to brainwash us into bullying each other. I'm tying it all together in part 3, where I'll break down a little bit more some of the entertainment that's dictated our social norms and why, with our social mores dictated more by religious values, and those social norms being pulled to extremes with no regard for consequences, all in the name of greed, It's no wonder that American society is filling in the blanks on those 7 deadly sins. Toxic masculinity is a cancer that's eaten through the core fibers of our ethics, integrity, morals, and spirituality. For those defending toxic masculinity, let's acknowledge what it is they're fighting for. They're fighting for the kind of bully culture and competition culture where there can be only one, and anyone who isn't is a loser. It's the culture of keeping women in their place and making sure if you're a fella who acts fancy, you ain't allowed to be out too late. We've been bred into this cult of bravado, machismo, and toxic masculinity. But pay attention, because masculinity isn't altogether bad. It's a part of this complete breakfast. But there's so much more here than just bravado and machismo. That thirst for blood, snickering at the schadenfreude, and delighting in being a man. What do they mean when they say it? It isn't always positive. This is more than pull yourself up by your bootstraps, quit your whining, and get back to work, but it plays into that perfectly. This is a culture of normalizing being mean to one another, being mean to ourselves, being mean, period. It's amping up that testosterone without the necessary balance to make us more than just cartoon caricatures of our inner selves. In the next episode, I'm digging a little deeper into my own personal and problematic past, wondering why it was ever okay to be me and what contributed to this atmosphere and environment of a boys' club, locker room, grab 'em by the promotion work culture, and the entertainment programming that has conditioned us all to be dicks to each other, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, is available on Amazon, and you can link up to that through my website, joshbrandonmedia.com. You can also check out the video for my new single, Small Town, under the name Sir Talks a Lot. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. You'll find all my original music, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my voice acting and voiceover career. It's all there in playlists for you to check out for your convenience. Check out my merch store and get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. More products are always coming soon. Follow me on TikTok or Instagram, everywhere you can online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel and do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. If you like this series, it's my full-time job. Consider a donation to my Cash App or, just hit the merch store at joshbrandonmedia.com. I've got plenty to offer. Sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.